Hi everybody, welcome to today's story time. We're reading the third book in the Universal series, A Mirror of Miracles, and we're on chapter 6, Building Bridges. As Molly lay in the bed, she tossed from side to side. Each time she closed her eyes, she felt like she was back in the river, her body being swept away by the water, gasping for air. Molly shot open her eyes once more as she feared, rigid inside. She moved her pillow to the end of the bed where she could lay looking out at the window. Molly watched the moon move across the night sky. Her mind became stiller as the stars speckled the sky. Somewhere up there Nannerl is off probably on her own adventures, Molly thought to herself. Molly became even more uncomfortable as she started to realise that she was losing everyone that ever meant anything to her. No more Nannerl, no more Mum and Dad. Do I have to decide who I want to live with? What if I don't want to live with either of them? Nannerl, I'm so confused and lost. Help me find my way back home, Molly whispered. Molly continued to stare at the moon illuminating the night sky. As her mind became silent, she took in a breath and felt the air fill her lungs as she let out a sigh. Molly's gaze drifted across the room, and as she scanned, she saw the single wooden chair in the corner with her clothes draped over, then a chest of drawers with a mirror resting on top. Molly sat up and looked at the mirror. Well, I guess there is no time like now, she said as she walked towards the mirror. She lifted it off the chest of drawers and placed it on the ground, leaning it up against the wall. Molly sat down, crossed her legs and stared into the mirror. As she looked at her reflection, she began to frown. Maybe this isn't going to be as easy as I thought, she said, as she continued to scowl at herself. Molly looked away, placing her head on her hand, which rested on her leg. But I don't like what I see, Molly said to the night sky. She glanced back at her reflection out of the corner of her eye as the feelings of desperation began to take over. I really don't see how this is going to help. Come on, Molly, get a grip of your thoughts. Molly readjusted herself in front of the mirror. Miracle Molly, how would she see herself? Molly said, as her face changed to a look of confusion. Confused? Angry? As she made an angry face. Sad? As she pretended to wipe away a tear. Funny? As she stuck her tongue out and began to smile at herself. Yes, that's it, smiley. As Molly sat smiling to herself, she started to feel her shoulders relax as she rested a hand on each knee. Strong too, she said, looking at herself sitting tall. Molly closed her eyes. What would home feel like? As she asked, as a warmth of excitement flowed round her body, making her smile even more. Molly opened her eyes slowly and saw herself beaming with happiness, positive that anything is possible. I just need to be patient until it does. But be persistent each day to reach it, Molly said to herself. Molly closed her eyes again as she focused on the excited feeling that was still growing stronger inside of home. Molly started to chuckle, then opened her eyes as she bounced around the floor. Molly could no longer sit still anymore, feeling so thrilled about the thought of home. Yes, she yelled, waving her arms in the air. She then flung her arms to her mouth as she remembered everyone was still asleep and continued to try and smuggle her giggles of joy. Molly looked back at herself in the mirror and didn't recognise the person who was now staring back at her. Is it really easy to feel so good? She said to herself as she looked straight into her eyes as they sparkled. Of course it is, she said to herself confidently. Molly stood back up and walked across to her bed, climbed back in, pulled the duvet up to her chin and looked out the window. Where the moon was beginning to disappear out of sight, Molly let her eyes slowly close, still smiling to herself as sleep slowly crept in. Molly awoke to a thud, followed by another thud on her bed, as she sleepily opened her eyes to find Hugh and Aidan sitting there. Molly wearily rubbed her eyes. Morning, lads, she said croakily as she propped herself up. So what was last night all about? Hugh asked eagerly. Molly let out a yawn. What do you mean? She said, bewildered. We heard you yelling last night, Hugh said impatiently. Molly began to smile again as she remembered how she had felt when she was in front of the mirror. Molly sprang out of bed and went to sit back down in front of the mirror, crossing her legs. Molly turned back around. Well, come on, she said to Hugh and Aidan. Aidan and Hugh climbed off the bed, walked across to the room and sat either side of Molly. Molly sat up and began to smile, placing her hands on her knees. She slowly closed her eyes as she searched inside for that feeling of home. Hugh and Aidan watched as she scowled, then frowned. I don't get it, Molly said as her eyes shot open. I can't find it, she said, frustrated. Last night I did this and I found the feeling of home and it felt so amazing. There was so much love and happiness that I couldn't keep it in. That's why I screamed. I was so excited. Molly looked back at her reflection. But I can't seem to find it now, she finished. Aidan placed his hand on Molly's shoulder. The fact that you know what you're looking for means you're halfway there, he said. Molly smiled gratefully at Aidan. I guess so. I just need to be patient. I just need to practice, she replied. Sally peered round the door as she stared at the three of them sitting cross-legged on the floor. I won't ask, she said, shaking her head. Breakfast is on the table, she announced, before exiting and heading to the decking. Hugh and Aidan got up and followed Sally. Molly watched them leave the room. She turned back to the mirror and began to smile at herself. She moved her fingers so it was touching the mirror as she watched her reflection touch back. I'm not going to give up on you, ever, she said with conviction to herself. Molly stood up and lifted her clothes that were draped over the back of the chair. She took off her PJs and pulled on her clothes before heading out towards the decking area to find everyone sitting around the table. Molly walked across to sit down next to Ben. Morning, Miss Molly, Ben said, smiling across at her as he reached and placed some bacon on his plates in front of her. Morning, Molly said, as she took some bread and made herself a bacon sandwich. What do you think about this route? John said, placing the map down on the table and pointing to a line on the map as he looked at Ben. John, please, can't it wait until after breakfast? Sally said, cross as she lifted the corner of the map out of her coffee. John lifted the map back up, smirking to himself. Of course, love, he said mockingly. Sally glared back at him. We'll do well not to get lost. I think Ben should be in charge of the map, she retorted. Spoil sport, where is your sense of adventure? John asked, pushing his chair back from the table and placing the map down on his knees. Like I was saying, he said, motioning for Ben to look. Ben glanced down and then looked up across the landscape. Yeah, I think that will be good. It should only take us a few hours hiking, he said. Sally stood up from the table, should being the key word in that sentence, she remarked as she looked across towards John before heading inside to fetch some more bacon. Sally reappeared with another plate of bacon and placed it in the centre of the table. Multiple hands reached in to take a piece and the plate became empty again. Well, eat up everyone, we'll head out in 30 minutes, John said, getting up from the table, holding the map. Yes, Captain, Aidan said as he saluted before taking a large bite out of his bacon sandwich. Sally sat back down and took hold of her coffee as she leaned back in her chair. We are on holiday, there is no rush, she said as she took a sip. John looked at Sally and raised his eyebrows before disappearing inside. Ali looked across at Sally. Maybe we should just let the men take the kids and we'll stay here drinking tea, Ali said dreamily. Sally looked at Ali. You know what? That isn't such a bad idea, Sally said as she sat a moment and thought about it. I was only joking, Ali said, smiling. Well, I think it's a great idea, Sally stated as she called John, who reappeared at the doorway. Change of plan, Sally said. What? Already? We haven't even left the cabin. We don't get lost, it's just that you're always changing your mind, John said in jest. Get down off your high horse. Ali and I are calling a time out. The kids are going to go with you and Ben whilst we'll do whatever we want to do, Sally said sternly. John nodded in acknowledgement. Okay, he said before returning back inside. Ali looked across to Molly. Is that all right with you? She said. Molly nodded in agreement. You guys had better get your stuff ready before the captain comes back, Sally said, laughing. Hugh and Aidan and Molly got up from the table and picked up their plates. Don't worry about the washing up. I'll do it in a minute, Ali called after them. Sally got up too. I best be making sure they're taking the right things, she said as she followed them inside. Ali stood up and moved into the chair next to Ben. Ben leaned back and wrapped his arm around her shoulder. You seem more settled today, Ali noticed. Ben smiled. I needed this trip, just to get my head straight again. There's something about a change of scenery that helps you to get a different view on life, he mused. Does it have anything to do with your old dad? Ali cautiously inquired. Ben lifted his arm from around Ali's shoulder and leaned forward. There are a few bridges that have been burned in my life. I can forgive, but I'm still working on the forgetting part, Ben said, looking at his feet. Well, the good thing about bridges is that new ones can always be rebuilt, Ali said, getting up and kissing him on the cheek. She reached for his plate and made her way into the kitchen. Ben sat for a moment looking out at the landscape as the sun shone brightly, listening to the silence. He looked back in Ali's direction. I never thought of it like that before, Ben muttered to himself. Ben took out his phone from his back pocket and began to write a new message. I know you only wanted the best for me. That's the reason you pushed me. Even though I resented you when I left, I am grateful for everything you did and taught me, even if it's not the way I would have done it. But I needed to leave to find my own way through this world, to create my own life and see what I could achieve in my own way. I never stopped loving you, Pa. It's just that sometimes I didn't always like you. We burned so many bridges, but maybe we could now start to rebuild some new ones. We'll be back at the ranch this evening and we'll be having a barbecue with everyone. You could come over and maybe we could make a start on rebuilding those bridges. Ben. Ben looked at the screen as he read the words back to himself and pressed send. Ben slipped the phone back in his pocket and walked into the cabin, feeling a weight in his heart had begun to lift. As he walked into the living room, he found Aidan, Hugh and Molly with their rucksacks and Sally checking through them. Aidan, you'll need to take your raincoat jacket just in case, she said. Aidan looked out of the window confused. Have you not seen the weather out there? It's sunny, he protested. Weather can change, and quickly. Oh, and don't forget to brush your teeth, Sally said, pointing towards his room. Aidan dragged his feet as he made his way towards his room and grabbed his raincoat. He took it with him into the bathroom and walked to the sink where he got his toothbrush and toothpaste. He began to brush his teeth and look at his reflection in the mirror. He ran his spare hand through his hair and spat out the toothpaste. He rinsed his mouth with water and wet his hand and ran it through his hair again, causing it to become spiky. Aidan stood up taller, pushed his shoulders back and looped his thumbs in front pockets, like he had seen his dad do. As he continued to look at himself, he started to see someone different. He stared at the confident part of himself as he lifted his hand and pretended to shake someone's hand. Hi, I'm Aidan, he said firmly, and looped his thumb back in his jeans. He looked longingly at his reflection and saw for the first time the person he could be. He then reached and grabbed a towel and rubbed his hair dry. His shoulders slumped forwards again, returning back to the Aidan he knew only too well. He reached and grabbed his coat, feeling disheartened, and made his way back into the living room. Sally turned to Molly as she looked through her bag. Yes, you've got everything. Would you mind going and fetch the bottles of water that are cooling in the fridge? Sally asked. Sure, Molly said as she walked to the kitchen. Okay, Hugh, let's take a look. Sally lifted his bag. Wow, what have you got in here? Rocks? Sally said, struggling to lift it as she looked inside. She saw that the bag was full to the brim. No, just the bare essentials, Hugh replied. I think you forgot to pack the kitchen sink, Sally said, smiling back at him. I would suggest you lighten it a bit because you'll sure get tired quickly carrying that around for a couple of hours, Sally said. Hugh stood up from the couch and looked in his bag. He rummaged through it and took a few items before zipping it back up. I'll be fine, Hugh said, throwing his bag on his back. Molly returned to the living room, followed by John and Ben. Molly passed each of them a bottle of water and Aidan shoved his jacket in his rucksack. Right, are we good to go? John said, making his way towards the front door. Sally kissed Aidan on top of his head. Look after him for me, she said, looking across to John. Will do, Aidan said, giving her a hug before making his way over to the front door. Ali appeared out of the kitchen as she walked over to Molly and Hugh. You look after each other, Ali said with concern. Always do, Mum, Hugh said, walking across and hugging her before following John and Aidan, who had made their way outside. Molly began to follow. See you in a couple of hours, she said. Ali reached over and hugged her. Just no swimming today, all right? I'm nearly out of tea, Ali chuckled. I promise, Molly replied considerately before heading outside. I'll go and make us a fresh drink, Sally said, excusing herself from the living room. Ben stepped towards Ali. Thank you for earlier. I needed to hear that. I had never thought of it that way before. I kind of got used to the idea that this was how it was meant to be with my pa, but I've invited him over for the barbecue tonight so we can start to rebuild those bridges, Ben said. Wow, do you actually mean that for once I helped you? Ali said, pretending to be shocked. Well, I wouldn't go that far, Ben said jokingly. I love you, Ali, even though I probably don't say it often enough. I think it all the time, he said. Ben walked out and closed the front door behind him. Ooh-wee, Sally said. Ali turned around and saw Sally holding 2 cups. Shall we? She said, motioning towards the decking. Absolutely, Ali said with a spring in her step as they headed back out onto the decking in the sunshine. John led the way, followed closely by Aidan, Hugh and Molly, with Ben walking at the back. They crossed the road and followed the footpath as it began to climb up the land. Hugh began repeating to himself, every day I am getting better, as I always succeed at what I set out to achieve. I am a champion. He spoke it to the rhythm of his footsteps as he followed on behind John. Aidan turned round and raised his eyebrows at Molly as they listened to Hugh repeating his new thought over and over again. Molly smiled back, recalling the feeling she had got earlier and the strength it had given her from deep inside. As Molly walked, she thought, I'm sure that finding the feeling is the way. It's meant to be done. Ben came up alongside Molly as the climb got steeper and Molly slowed down. Come on, we're burning daylight, John ordered as he powered on, closely followed by Hugh and Aidan. Ben looked across at Molly. We'll go at our own pace. At least then the world won't look like a blur as it passes us by. We'll get the chance to see the detail, he smiled as he too slowed down. That sounds like a good plan to me, Molly said, stopping to catch her breath. As she looked down at the ground, she saw a funny pattern in the soil. Ben followed her gaze, then looked up and scanned the land. Look, over there, he exclaimed. As Molly followed where Ben was pointing, they watched a snake gracefully glide along silently. Molly froze as she watched the snake disappear. You know you can breathe at any point, Ben said jokingly, as he saw Molly's mouth clamp shut. Molly took a gasp of air as she looked at Ben, eyes wide with fear. There's nothing to worry about, it's harmless, Ben said as he gently guiding her to continue walking. Some people say the snake reminds us that there are great healing opportunities around. Change, important transitions to be made, and with increased energy to create. If you look at it like that, then the snake is your friend, your guide, Ben said as he passed Molly and walked ahead. Molly stopped for a moment and looked behind her at where the snake had disappeared. I don't want to change or make important transitions. I want everything to go back to the way it was, she said to the snake with certainty. What's right isn't necessarily what's easiest, Ben called back before disappearing over the brow of the hill. Molly quickly scurried after him, not wanting to be left alone where snakes were roaming. As she made it over the brow of the hill, she saw everyone sitting down on a cluster of rocks. She walked across, sat down next to Aidan, took out her bottle of water and had a drink. Aidan sat distantly looking out onto the horizon as Ben moved across and sat down next to John as they surveyed the map. Everything all right? Molly asked Aidan. Yeah and no, Aidan said, feeling disheartened as he rolled his bottle of water between his hands. I tried to see myself confidently this morning whilst I was brushing my teeth, and I felt like a fool, like I was just being a kid again, being stupid, Aidan said, feeling ashamed. Molly looked confused. Just because it's uncomfortable doesn't mean that it's a bad thing. If everyone stayed the way other people had told and taught them to be, then we would all still be living in caves. Believe in what others can't see yet, because someday they will see what you have known all along, Molly added, as she placed her bottle back in her rucksack and stood up. It's something Nana O taught me, Molly finished, as she watched John and Ben get up too and start to walk again. Molly began to follow as Aidan stood up silently, following behind and thinking about Molly's words. Hugh sat still as he watched everyone begin to disappear down the path, continuing to repeat to himself, every day I'm getting better, as I as I always succeed at what I set out to achieve. I am a champion." Tears began to roll down his cheeks as the words cut into his heart like a razor blade. Hugh thought back to all the times that he had failed, when he had missed a shot or his loop went wrong, all the people watching him that he felt he had let down. Every day, Hugh stuttered. He quickly stood up, violently throwing his bottle of water out in front of him. "I hate you!" he screamed with pure rage. "Why can't it be me?" he continued as his face reddened. As he felt every muscle in his body tighten, his fist clenched as he kicked a lump of dirt and collapsed to his knees. He closed his eyes. "Why not me? Why not now?" he whispered, as a gentle breeze whirled around his face, cooling his tears and stilling his heart. He heard it and felt nothing, as the numbness grew from inside his heart to all around his body. As he scanned around the landscape for guidance and hope, he saw nothing. He continued waiting. "Hugh, where are you?" he heard John's voice call from a distance. Hugh looked up at the sky. "You abandoned me. I asked for help, and you leave me here lost when I needed you the most," Hugh said with malice. He stood up and began to walk down the path, still numb as the darkness grew inside and turned his blood to venom. "Oh, sorry, son," a man apologised as he bumped into Hugh. Hugh stared blankly at him, and the man held his gaze. Hugh saw a sparkle in his eyes, like he was looking through a keyhole to his heart. "You know, sometimes, son, the only thing we need to do is surrender to the moment. Let the hand that created us do its job. Worry is a terrible disease. It distorts and drives us crazy, causing you to no longer hear your guidance, see the opportunities, or have the strength to take action. All power and clarity is lost to something that most of the time won't come true," the man said before walking on by and continuing on his way. Hugh stood motionless as he awoke from his fury back to reality. He felt the life return in his fingers and legs. "I surrender. I sort out what we are doing. You sort out how we are going to get there," Hugh said, looking up at the sky before running to catch up with the others. As the sun reached the top of the sky and the temperature rose, Ben and John scanned the land to see the cluster of log cabins at the bottom of the hill. "Right, you lot. We better head back before the ladies think we have got lost," John said, quickening his pace, as Hugh, Molly and Aidan jogged behind him to keep up with him. Ben slowed down as he enjoyed the harmony that surrounded him. He remembered the day he saw the deer whilst out riding, knowing what was awaiting him at the country fair and rodeo. "I just need a sign," he whispered as he placed his hand in his pocket, holding the small box between his fingers. A noise of a small rock dislodging behind him caused Ben to turn around to see a deer in the centre of the path looking straight at him. Ben stood motionless. "What have you got to tell me?" he thought as the deer turned round and made its way back up the path. Ben quickly scurried to follow the deer. As he reached the top of the hill, he looked down the other side to see the deer joining another deer with two fawns, eating. The deer stopped eating and looked at Ben. Ben crouched down and sat down on the dirt path, watching the four of them peacefully together. A family. A noise came from behind Ben as the deer's head shot up and they quickly disappeared. Ben turned around and saw Molly standing there. "Sorry," she said, pointing to the deer running off into the distance. "We just wondered where you were," Molly said, looking concerned. Ben stood back up. "I just had to follow something to find an answer," Ben winked at Molly, as he walked past her and followed the path back to the others. Molly looked down at the deer and then back at Ben. "Okay then," she said, feeling confused as she followed Ben. "Ah, there you are," John said, raising his hands up in the air. "Shall we?" he said impatiently, as he continued to make his way down the path to the cabins. Ben pretended to salute to John in jest, causing Hugh and Aidan to giggle. Molly reached forward, took hold of Ben's hand and held it tight. "I thought I'd lost you too," she said quietly. Ben squeezed her hand. "Not a chance. You'll have to try harder to achieve that," he said, smiling at her. Molly hugged his arm as they neared the cabins. "Sally, the wanderers have returned," Ali called, as she saw them approaching. "Is that kettle on?" John called back. Ali disappeared as she returned to the kitchen. John stepped onto the decking and plonked himself down in one of the chairs, followed quickly by Hugh and Aidan. Molly held tightly onto Ben's arm as they joined everyone on the decking. Sally and Ali returned with plates full of foods and drinks and placed them on the table. "I'll just go and get that cup of tea for you," Ali said, smiling at John. Ali returned back into the kitchen. Ben peeled Molly off his arm. "I'll be back in a minute. I just need to speak to Ali," he said. As he walked towards the door, he paused and looked back at the table. "Everyone, stay where you are until I say otherwise," Ben said desperately before heading inside. As he made his way into the kitchen, Ali was picking up the cup of tea. Ben stepped in towards her and reached for the cup, taking it from her hands and placing it down on the worktop. He looked straight into Ali's eyes with devotion. Ali became uneasy. "I have been trying to find the right moment," Ben said, shaking his head at the turmoil he had been fighting inside. "But I've come to realise that sometimes the perfect moment is disguised in an ordinary moment, that the perfect moment is created by our words and actions. Ali, when I first saw you dancing with Hugh, I turned to Tom and said, 'That is the woman I'm going to marry.' I wanted to ask you the first night we met." Ben paused. Slipping his hand in his jeans pocket, he took out the small box and opened it up. "Ali, will you do me the absolute honour of becoming my wife? I promise to love you unconditionally, support your dreams, but most of all, every day, in every way, we will bring out the best in each other," he finished. Ali stood there staring at the ring sparkling in the sunshine streaming through the window. She looked at Ben and then back at the ring, then up at Ben, speechless. Ben took hold of her left hand and gently slid the ring on her finger. Ali nodded, beaming, as she flung her arms around his neck and leapt up into his arms. She stared deep into his eyes as she leaned forward to kiss him. "Our first forever kiss," Ali said, glowing at Ben, whirled her around the kitchen in delight. Ali's smile began to disappear as she climbed out of his arms and took a step back. Ben froze with fear. "You've not changed your mind already," he said as he watched her slip off the ring. Ali stared down at the ring she held between her fingers. As she looked up, "No, of course not. It's just, I don't think it would quite be right for us to go back to the ranch saying we're going to get married when Molly's parents are splitting up. It's kind of like rubbing salt into the wound," she whispered. Ben sunk his hands deep into his pocket, not able to hide his disappointment. Tears formed in his eyes as he saw Ali's holding the ring. "You're right," Ben said. "But how about you wear your ring just until we return back to the ranch?" he said, searching for hope. "Ben, I'm forever yours, and just know that it's our words that are the bond binding our hearts. It's the small commitments we honour and keep every day that are just as important as saying I do." Ali slipping the ring back on as she stepped forward and wrapped her arms back around Ben's neck. They swayed in the kitchen to the rhythm of their heartbeats. "So, this is the secret you have been keeping from me," Ali said, raising her eyebrows. Ben grinned. "Well, I wasn't sure how much longer I was going to survive if I kept it from you," he said boldly. Ali blushed at her earlier behaviour. She reached behind her and took a sip of John's tea. "Perfect for every situation," he said, taking her hand. "Absolutely," Ali said as she intertwined her fingers with his. They stepped out into the living room where they were met by an eruption of cheers. They saw everyone crammed up against the doorway as they had been listening in. "Finally!" Sally said, breaking free with joy and hugging Ali, as John quickly took the cup of tea from Ali before it was tipped onto the floor. John stepped forward and shook Ben's hand. "Congratulations," he said. Ben beamed with pride. "Thanks, mate," he replied. Hugh stepped forward and wrapped his arms around both of them. "I thought I was going to burst if I had to keep the secret much longer," he said, ecstatic. Aidan stepped forward and hugged them too. Molly stayed in the doorway and watched everyone as they celebrated and shined with joy. She turned around and started to walk back to the table. Ben nudged Ali, who was twirling around with Hugh. Ben glanced across to where Molly was, and Ali nodded as she walked outside and kneeled down in front of Molly. "Now, every woman needs a bridesmaid, and I can't think of anyone better who would want to be by my side than you. Molly, would you do me the honour of helping me make it through the day?" Ali asked. Molly pretended to brush some dust off her legs as Ben joined Ali, crouching down and wrapping his arm around her waist. We want all our family to be part of this, and Molly, you are part of our family, Ben emphasised. Molly began to cry as she nodded and flung her arms around them both. Hugh quickly came up behind, joining in as he wrapped his arms around all three of them. At some point, I need to breathe, Ali said, muffled beneath a pile of arms. Everyone began to peel themselves off Ali, gasped for air. As they all returned to their seats, Ben pulled his chair up close to Ali's. He took hold of her hand and he played with the ring with his fingers. Sally reached up the table and pulled out a bottle of champagne. Just a little something to celebrate, she exclaimed. As she placed it down on the table, she reached across for 4 glasses. She had hidden 2. As the cork popped, Sally sprayed Hugh and Aidan with the champagne. "Oh, Mum, stop it," Aidan said, brushing off the champagne bubbles. Sally poured the champagne into the glasses as John passed one to Ali and then Ben, also taking one for himself. "Here's to the next chapter. May it be the best one yet," John said, raising his glass up to the sky. This was quickly followed by everyone else raising their glasses of champagne and orange juice. They sat there in silence, soaking up the sunshine. Then Ali let out a groan as she let her head flop back. Hugh began to laugh as he knew exactly what she was thinking. "So, when are you going to tell her?" Hugh said, his laugh growing louder. Ali let out a louder groan as Ben began to smirk. "Not today, that's for sure," she said, lifting her head back up to look across at Hugh. "It's not funny, monkey. I think you should tell her," Ali said teasingly. "No way," he yelled back. Ali began to laugh too. "Well, if it's all right with everyone, I think we should head back to the ranch and settle in for the barbecue. We'll skip the fishing this time round," Ben said, looking at Ali. "Sounds good to us," John said, as his body began to ache from the walk earlier on. "Okay, you 3, can you go and pack your stuff up and put it in the living room," Sally instructed, looking directly at Hugh, Aidan and Molly. Hugh opened his mouth to respond and felt a nudge from Ali's foot from under the table. "Of course, Sally," Hugh said politely. The 3 of them got up and walked inside to their bedrooms. "Have you guys had any luck?" Molly asked, agitated. Hugh and Aidan stopped, looking back at Molly. Aidan looked down at his feet and shook his head. "No. Every time I get close to seeing myself as confident, I am then flooded with memories of all the times I wasn't," he said. "I'm the same. Each time I repeat it, I just become angry that I am nowhere near it," Hugh said, disappointed. "Me too. I can't seem to find that feeling since this morning," Molly said, agreeing. "What are we doing wrong?" Molly asked. Aidan shrugged. "It beats me," he exclaimed. "I don't hear much movement back there," Sally called. Aidan rolled his eyes. "I'm sure they are in a constant contest to see who can be the bossiest," he said, quietly looking towards his parents. They all went into their rooms and began to pack up their things. Ali made her way through and glanced into the bedrooms. She saw the 3 of them busily shoveling their clothes and belongings into their bags. She walked into her own room and sat down on the edge of the bed. She stared at the ring that shimmered and sparkled in the light, like a star in the night sky. Ali felt her heart about to burst with joy and love, but at the same time her veins filled with fear. "What if I'm going to lose him too? I won't be able to go on," she mumbled to herself. "Stop it, Ali. Just have a little faith," Ali demanded of herself, as the fear retreated and left her feeling like a child on Christmas Day. Ben walked into the room and made his way across to Ali. "Hello, missus," he said, proud of the way that sounded. Ali began to laugh as the joy bubbled out of her body. Ben placed his bags on the bed and started to pack his things. "This is one crazy ride," Ali said, getting up and collecting her belongings. Ben glanced up. "The best ride there is," he replied. Molly, Aidan and Hugh made their way into the living room, placed their bags down in the centre and flopped on the couch as Sally buzzed in and out with things from the kitchen. "She makes me feel travel sick sometimes at the rate she moves," Aidan said, as Sally whirled in and out like a tornado. Ben, John and Ali soon joined the 3 of them, and Ben and John started to carry the bags outside to the trucks. "Do you want some help, Dad?" Aidan said, watching him walking towards the front door. "Yep, you can all bring down some bags," John called over his shoulder. Ali walked into the kitchen and nearly crashed into Sally. It's all done, Sally said, herding Ali back out into the living room. Sally brushed past her and out of the front door. Well, I'll go and double check no one's left anything in their rooms, Ali said to herself. Ali looked around the rooms, closing each door behind her. As she walked back into the living room, having one more glance around, her gaze stopped at the kitchen. Tea and a proposal. What more could a woman want? Alice thought as she made her way out of the front door and closed it behind her. She walked towards the truck where everyone was waiting. Ben looked across. Good to go? He asked. Good to go, Ali responded. Okay, kids, time to load up, John bellowed. We'll follow you back, John suggested, as Ben climbed into the driver's seat. Sure thing, Ben said, starting up the truck, as the chime of seatbelts clicked. The trucks reversed and turned around as they made their way back down the road towards the exit, with John, Sally and Aidan following behind. Ben reached across and took hold of Ali's hand as the sun shone in a sapphire blue sky and they heard an eagle call from up above. Well, life can change pretty quickly around here, Ali said as she began to watch the countryside roll by. I go into Yellowstone as one woman and come back out a completely different one. She smiled across to Ben. Well, these places are magical, that's for sure, he replied as they drove out of the exit gate. Hugh and Molly looked at each other. I wish it had had the same effect on me, Hugh said, saddened. Molly smiled in agreement, but said nothing. How exciting! Right, I'll see you tomorrow for chapter 7. There's no place like home.